Hello there, and welcome back to Laurence Plays Factorio Planetary Pioneers, where you join me once again on Cubium, where I've managed to get my head a little bit more round the planet than I had for the last video. So today we're going to have another look at Cubium and deal with some emotions. To start with, since I've drawn this diagram, and don't worry, we'll go through it slowly so it'll be a lot less scary than it looks, I thought it would be nice to have another look at the processing chains on Cubium to get a better feel for how everything works. So if we zoom in on this bit, you can see this is where we're taking out the ultra-dense lava and the stone in order to make the ultra-dense substrate, which we can then turn into the blue cubes. Now the blue cubes are a little bit funny because they spoil over time and turn into the grey cubes, but then the grey cubes also spoil over time and turn back into the blue cubes, so it goes back and forth, and that's why we've got a loop here on the diagram. However, these cubes can then be used as catalysts in order to make other things, and when you use them as a catalyst, they will generally turn from a blue cube into a grey cube, which is what this icon here is showing. Cubes can be used as a catalyst with absolutely nothing at all in order to make jelly, which is quite nice. And then that jelly can be used with additional cubes in order to make more jelly, and this makes more jelly per cube, so it's very worth doing. Alternatively, if you chuck in some carbon as well, then you can make even more jelly per cube, and you get massive piles of it coming out. So this is a really quick and efficient way of producing lots and lots of the jelly if you've got carbon available to spend, which we do. If you leave jelly alone for too long, it will spoil into destabilized cube matter, this blue stuff, and then from there it will spoil on into the dream clouds, which we can use in other places around the factory. Once we've got a healthy supply of cube jelly together, we can start using that, often with a catalyst of additional cubes, in order to make various other products that are going to be very useful, like copper ore and iron ore, which you can then cook down into metals as we normally would. Or if you add in some carbon as well, then you can make plastic. And the dreams can be turned into ice. And these are how you produce all of the sort of the basic and the semi-basic resources over on Cubium. You don't really tend to dig up metals from the ground as such. Additionally, there's one other recipe that allows you to take in the grey cubes and turn them back into blue cubes and produce a load of water. And that's what we've got going on down here. This system is bringing in the grey cubes that we want to wake back up again, and then is mixing them with some jelly, which is made from carbon, and that gives us out then a steady supply of the slightly more lively cubes, or at least it does in theory. There's one going out there, for example. The next step in the process is making the yellow cubes, and these are made by smashing up blue cubes into shards, and that gives you at least some shards back of both blue and hopefully some shards of yellow, and once you get 100 of either type of shard, you can turn it into the appropriate cube. So you can see here that because we're taking in 2 energized microcubes and getting back between 100 and 200 energized shards, that means we are actually losing half a cube with each time this runs, but we are getting a 30% chance of getting about a fifth of a yellow cube. So eventually this will produce enough shards that we can make the yellow cubes, and then we can ship those out for doing other things. And what are those other things, you may ask? Well, over here, it turns out you can turn yellow cubes into red cubes by adding in some sulfuric acid, some water and some stone, and you get some calcite out as a byproduct of that. You can then turn the red cube back into a yellow cube by adding in some more water and sulfuric acid and some of the calcite you just made, but not all of it, so it's a net positive coming out of this. And also you have to chuck in a blue cube and turn it back into a grey cube for that as well. But this means this system, with a steady input of blue cubes, which we do have a nice supply of, means you can wake up as many of the red cubes back into yellow cubes as you want, and also generate as much calcite as you want, although it can be a slightly slow process. And so, why do we want those yellow cubes, I hear you ask? Well, that's because you can also use the yellow cubes as a catalyst to make some of the more advanced things, like red and blue circuits. And we're doing that over here, so you can bring in some metals and some jelly, and then use the yellow cube as a catalyst to make red circuits. Then you also bring in some green circuits and some calcite, which we got from the previous step we're looking at, and some ice. And oh yes, then we didn't need to talk about the dreams as well. This will allow you to make a blue circuit out of those. And in fact, these recipes make a lot of red circuits and a lot of blue circuits. So each time this runs, it produces 50 red circuits, and then each time this one runs, it produces 100 blue circuits. Now it does use 100 red circuits for that, granted, but it feels like a nice cheap way of making these things, as long as your yellow's cube supply can keep up. I said I'd have a quick look at the dreams. Well, over here we're dissolving some dreams in water, and that makes liquid dreams. And we're then concentrating that over here to make dream concentrate. This is a fairly simple process, but provides us with a very valuable resource that we're going to use quite a lot on this planet, not least for making blue circuits. So all of that up to here I talked about last week, but I hadn't made the nice pretty diagram, so I feel this has probably given you a better insight into what's been going on. The next thing to look at, this is where we're going to get a bit emotional. moving on down the chain, we then have this terrifying looking list of massive quantities of fluids. And I spent quite a lot of time sort of working on this, and part of the reason it was so difficult was it was quite slow to get the system up and running and bootstrapped. Partly because we didn't have enough of the yellow cubes coming through at the time, but also because some of the things just take a very long time to build up enough of the resource to actually start working properly. So here we have the first step. And we're bringing in ice, which is made from dreams, as we've seen, which is fairly easy. We're bringing in the yellow cubes to use as a catalyst, and we're bringing in some carbon. That's all fine. Those are all resources that we can make in large quantities just by, well, in the carbon's case, we dig it out of the ground in the form of coal. And the other two, we just make them out of cubes and jellies and things. So that's basically okay. And then we're able to put them into these machines here, and we can start making petroleum gas. This, as you can see, uses the yellow cube as a catalyst, and takes in all these resources, and then it produces actually a fair amount of petroleum gas. We get 300 out of this every time it runs. But in order to run it, we need some sulfur. And so we're taking that petroleum gas, and we're putting it into these machines over here, with some water, and then we're making sulfur. So, unfortunately, if you look at the numbers on these machines, these two recipes balance out perfectly. So you need exactly the same amount of sulfur to make the petroleum gas as you get from turning the petroleum gas back into sulfur. So to get around that, I put these productivity modules in these machines, which means we're getting an 18% productivity bonus. So every 5 and a bit times the machine runs, we get a little bit of spare back out, which we can then put into this tank down here. So we are making a little bit of profit over here, but only a very small amount. The initial sulfur to get the system bootstrapped I acquired by beating up one of the little volcano tower things like this one. So if you smash these, you get a little bit of sulfur out of it. That's the only sulfur supply I've managed to find on this planet, so we can't just go pumping lots and lots in order to make loads of petroleum gas. I've needed to make it grow through the magical productivity modules. So that took quite a long time to get up to a state of it actually working well enough, because we were very short of yellow cubes at the time. That has been fixed, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. But suffice to say, it is now working nicely, and as you can see, we've got all the yellow cubes we could possibly want here. Over here, so I've got the pump here, making sure there's always at least 5,000 petroleum gas in this tank, because we don't want to run out for the sulfur making, because if we do, the whole system could grind to a halt and we wouldn't be able to get it started again, because we'd have no sulfur. So that would be very awkward. But because of the magic of making a little bit extra, we're able to then pump a bit of the petroleum gas out here, where it goes into this machine, where we're doing a light oil by inversion, which takes in 4,500 petroleum gas. So you can see why it took a long time to get any ready and going and pass through here. As well as the standard cube and some more ice. And then that puts the cube to sleep, but it makes 3,000 light oil. So every time it runs, you do get a good amount of it coming out, but it takes a very long time to get that much together and to get it to run. So, okay, great, we've got some light oil, that's fun. Then we bring that over here with some of that dream concentrate I was talking about earlier, and that turns it into emotional tar. Okay, so we get a load of emotional tar, very good. Then we feed that along here into, well, we've got a tank full of it here, but we've also then putting it into an oil refinery, which can do emotional cracking, which I think is basically some form of cracking up, I don't know, you just go a little bit crazy. And that turns all of your emotional tar, with some water to sort of help lubricate things a little bit, into hope, anger and disgust. Yes, hope, anger and disgust. Great, so we've got some of these funny fluids coming out over here, and we're going to have to try and do something with them. So the hope is actually the one we want, so we're taking that away on a pipe down here, and we'll come back to that later. The other two, though, are basically byproducts that we don't, at least at the current state of the factory, I don't need either of them. So in an attempt to get rid of some of them, the anger comes out over this way and goes down this pipe over to here, where we feed it into this machine, which mixes it with some dreams, and so dreams and anger become hate and fear, which is a little bit negative. I suppose dreams and anger is a kind of nightmare, which so hate and fear seems vaguely reasonable, I don't know. But then the fear can then be brought down this pipe along here. It goes into here where we do fear inversion. So once again with a yellow cube we can turn the liquid fear into liquid courage. So it turns it into whiskey or vodka or something like that, I guess. And it turns out that if you mix over here, if you mix courage and fear together, then they annihilate each other and produce an enormous quantity of steam, which you can put into turbines to power your factory. So that's all utter weirdness, but it does seem to work. We can get rid of at least some of it that way. However, when you crack your anger into fear and loathing, into hate and fear, then you still have to do something with the hate. So we're passing that background here, and if you mix hate and disgust and a blue cube, you can turn it back into anger. By reconstituting it, apparently. So that uses up at least some of the liquid disgust, and we can pump the liquid hate through and get rid of it. So we're able to use that up reasonably nicely, which is why most of these tanks around here are completely empty. The one exception to this, unfortunately, is that this whole process is disgust positive. So you can't get rid of the disgust. We've got a tank over here. It's filled up to 13,000 disgust so far, and rather disgustingly appropriately, there's not really anything we can do with that. That is just a thing that is basically useless. If we look in the Factoriopedia, we see that we can put it into barrels. Great. We can do the anger reconstitution, which is fine. You doing that, but we don't have enough hate to get rid of all of our disgust. So that's not work. It's a start, but it's not enough. Additionally, we can turn it into hope spoilage, but then that requires you to mix it with your disgust with some hope, and we need the hope, so I don't really want to do that. And it takes as much hope as it does disgust. And if we look at the recipe over here in the emotional cracking, we are producing more hope than we're producing disgust, and some of the disgust is getting used up. So we could do that. We could turn it into spoilage. We don't have any actual need for spoilage on this planet. So what I'm thinking I'm probably going to end up doing, which is a little bit disgusting, but that's what feels appropriate, is I'm going to then end up putting this into barrels, because we've got a steady supply of steel over here that's being made out of jelly and therefore basically from nothing. So we've got plenty of steel. We can make barrels. We can put the disgust into barrels, and then we can conceal it away by dumping it into the lava pits up here, and it'll just get destroyed, and that'll be getting rid of our disgust, and we won't have to worry about it anymore. So I think it's not my favourite way of getting rid of byproducts. I'd rather use them for something vaguely useful, and at least we're managing to turn the anger into steam and turn it and get a little bit of power out of it. But I think this disgust is going to have to be thrown away because there's nothing else to do with it. The anger and hate can be turned into ammunition, but they aren't better ammunition. So I don't think it's worth the logistics effort of trying to transport them off and do things like that with them. And the disgust can't be done. You can't do anything useful with it at all. So I think that's just going to have to be thrown away. That brings us nearly to the end of the diagram. There's a little bit left to go on here, as you can see. And so over here, I'm doing the recipe we looked at before, where we're making solid fuel out of jelly with a carbon-based jelly generator over here. So that's making solid fuel, and we're then able to make these things, the dream fuel, by taking that solid fuel and mixing it with some liquid dream in the presence of a catalyst, as usual. And that allows us to make these pink cubes, which can then be brought around here to be added to some liquid hope, and that's where we need the hope for that I was talking about earlier. And again, in the presence of a catalyst, we can turn that into rocket fuel. So that's fantastic. That's making the rocket fuel that we're going to need in goodness knows what sort of quantities in order to start launching rockets off this planet. So that took me a while to put together, and as I say, partly because it's a convoluted and twisted process and I had to get my head round what order things were used in because I hadn't drawn the diagram at this point, but also because I was waiting for a lot of things to run, so it took a long time to get up enough petroleum gas to be able to make some light oil to be able to make the tar and then allow it to pass all the way through. But now we are actually making a slow but steady supply of the resources from here. I feel that the rocket fuel is not being made quickly enough because there's not very much on the belt, and in fact, if we look over here at the actual rocket silos, it has essentially all gone, so it needs to be sped up a bit, but that's not a serious problem. That's something we can do as and when we need to, and we are at least launching rockets. You can see along here that we do have 4 rockets available to head out as and when necessary. There is a little bit of an elephant in the room about this whole process, and that is that there is also another recipe in Factorio called coal liquefaction. And we do have a lot of coal on this planet. We could bring in some heavy oil from somewhere else, and we can make steam. That's not a problem. And that would allow us to then make heavy oil, light oil, petroleum gas, and then we can start making rocket fuel in a much more traditional way, just from light oil and petroleum gas, and making the solid fuel from those, and then making the rocket fuel from them. Basically the same system that I built up over on Norvis quite some time ago, although granted on a somewhat smaller scale. However, that's not very Cubium. So because these Cubium recipes were available, I felt that I should at least give it a try, doing it the proper Cubium way, as it were. And so this is what you see before you, and this is what you would have to do if you started on Cubium and you didn't have any resources that you could bring in, because you wouldn't be able to get any heavy oil on this planet. It just doesn't exist out here, and so you'd have to work through this system. And also, it was fun, and if I'd missed this out, if I'd skipped over this and just done coal liquefaction, we'd have missed out half of the recipes on Cubium. All of these dream-related nonsense going along through here. We wouldn't have done any of this. So I think I'm glad I went through and did it this way, even if it was a lot more complicated and a lot weirder than it absolutely had to be. And so that got us 2 of the bits and pieces needed for making rockets. We've got the blue circuits earlier from Sophia's production system using the yellow cubes. We've now got rocket fuel from my emotional breakdown over here. And then finally, we need to get low density structures. And those are actually reasonably easy on this planet because we've got a steady supply of copper and steel coming in from Sophia's metal working plants over on the other side. And it turns out there is a way of making plastic through a cube and jelly process. And so Mark has built this area up to make our low density structures. And it's bringing in cubes here, which we're turning into jelly using the very, very basic recipe, because you don't actually need that much jelly in order to have it work. We're then able to feed the jelly over into the machine here to turn it into plastic, which requires carbon and jelly and a cube-based catalyst, so that's relatively straightforward as Cubium-based stuff goes. So this machine is actually fast enough to run 2 plastic machines, and then 1 plastic machine is fast enough to run 3 low-density structure machines. And so we've made use of the diagonal inserters from Icarus here in order to allow 1 machine to direct insert into 3. This was an extra tweak I added in because we realised we were going to need the rockets a little bit faster than we thought we were at first, because Mark decided to be unreasonable in his demands. No, Mark decided he wanted to have a lot of Dream concentrate on Norvis, and I'll talk about that in a little while too. So I came in, added in the 2 extra machines here, and then was quite pleased to only need to put in the diagonal inserters to get that running. So those have been very useful. And so this is producing low density structures at a rate. It's not a particularly fast rate. I think this whole system is going to need to be expanded, but there's plenty of room to the north to do that, to double it, triple it, whatever. I'm wondering if we could come up with a sensible way to use 1 machine making the jelly to feed multiple 2 machines making plastic, because as I say, this one takes in 1.25 jelly per second. This makes 2.5 jelly per second, so this could easily run 2 of these, and then have each one of these feeding into 3. I think that's going to be a little tricky, but maybe if I tried to put this one sort of in this gap here between them, then it could feed up and down. I feel like I could come up with something quite neat around that to make it work. But yes, so this is now making the low density structures. They're being made, they're being taken away for rockets, and as you probably just heard, we've just launched a rocket, so you can tell the system is working. Another tweak I did make over here was to a cube freshness checker, because this belt here doesn't flow very quickly, and so there's a fairly high chance that somewhere along here we'll find some duff cubes, some grey cubes that have gone to sleep because they've been on the belt for more than half an hour, like these ones all the way along here, for example. And so ideally we'd like to chuck those off and put them onto and dump them onto a disposal belt, as is happening here, like this. But that's not always possible. We'll occasionally end up with some of them if a machine runs particularly slowly for a while, where they just don't come through quite as quickly as we hoped. And so I've made the belt run round and round in a loop here like this, and we're checking to make sure that everything is fresh at this point. So they're only letting the cubes through, the blue cubes through here, and you can see that means we end up with occasional gaps when cubes have gone off, and then we can top those up from the belt down here. So we can guarantee that we'll get a nice steady stream of blue cubes coming through here, and therefore these inserters are always going to be able to grab a blue cube. Previously we had an insert that was taking off and putting from any grey cubes from here onto the dump belt, and that was a problem here because this area is quite crowded, and because the cubes aren't always in freshness order, should we say. If you knew that the most spoiled cubes were always going to be at the front of the cube, then it'd be fine, because you could just have something on the end taking them off when they're spoiled, and you'd know that as long as you were taking off the spoiled ones, everything else on that belt was fresh. But the cubes tend to be a lot more stirred up than that. As you can see here, there is 1 duff cube in the middle of the belt, so that could cause problems, because it could come up to here, and we find that we were trying to take grey cubes off the end of the belt, but we weren't able to take any blue cubes off here, because this section of belt is filled up with grey ones that we couldn't take off from here. And this only gets worse if you try and expand systems, because you can then get more and more traps for them. Somebody did suggest in the comments on the last video that I could put in a diagonal inserter here to also grab off this square, so we'll be able to have 3 inserters grabbing off the same square here, and taking them off and dumping them over this way. And that would work, but also having them going round and round in a loop like this will also work as well. Other places it's not quite so vital. You can see over here we've got an inserter taking away the grey cubes from the same place that the inserter is taking away the blue cubes, and so when that grey cube does make it up to the front of the cube here, this one will take it away immediately and dump it onto the belt, which means the blue cubes behind it can then be fed into the machine making the rocket fuel, and things will be okay. But anywhere where you've got lots and lots of machines doing stuff, so here for example, you're hoping that you won't jam up on grey cubes in here, or at least if you do, that they'll get pulled out from up here. But again, this is another area where it could possibly go wrong. So having these loops in everywhere where we're using cubes might be a good idea. The only problem is that we didn't really think of that when we were first building the system, and so there's lots of places where there isn't really room to do that without making things very, very large, or just dumping all of the blue cubes back out onto the blue belt down here, which we could do, but I don't really like that idea. It feels sort of, I don't know, it just doesn't feel quite right somehow. So, Mark making low density structures meant that we had everything we needed to make rockets, so I tasked Mike with actually making the rocket silos in order to do so. So he's done that nicely over here. We've got a steady stream of iron coming in, that's being made into pipes and cogs. Lovely, we've got loads of those. And those are then being made into steam engines because we need those generally around the factory. So I decided to put them into a red chest here to make them available. But also, because on Cubium, if you want to make motors, you need to use this recipe. You need to use the recipe that takes in engine units, steam engines, and yellow cubes, and then produces you your engine units. So that's a little bit weird. In fact, that's not quite true. That's a lot weird, but it does seem to make the engine units. So okay, there. Fine. The standard engine unit recipe is just steel and iron, so we could have used this one, but you know, we're on Cubium, so we're trying to use the Cubium recipes as and where we can. And so that allows us to make a load of engine units, which we then pass over to here to make electric engines, and this again uses the inverted microcubes and a load of dreams, but it does produce quite a lot of engine units at a time. But if we look back here, we can see that this one produces 70 engine units every time it runs, this one produces 100 electric engines, so you're getting quite an efficient method of producing things, and that's kind of what Cubium is about. You get weird recipes that involve cubes and inversions and stuff, but it makes things a bit more efficient. You get larger numbers out for the amount of stuff you've put in. With this one, however, we wouldn't have been able to use the standard electric engine recipe because we don't have lube on this planet and we don't have heavy oil, so we can't make lube. So we weren't able to do this. Now, we could have done the carbon-based electric engine unit recipe where you use carbon for the lube instead. This is one from Maluna, but as I say, we're on Cubium, we'll use the Cubium recipes. From there, yep, loads and loads of electric engine units, they can be passed off, and then we're making some sand in order to make concrete. We've got plenty of iron ore to crush as well, to make the crushed iron ore and to allow us to make the concrete. That's brought over to here, where we can pump it in here, along with blue circuit steel, pipe, and whatever else we need, in order to then make the rocket silos. And so, having made some rocket silos, we've got 4 of them in place over here. These are set up to export the things we're expecting to need to export, so we're going to be sending out cubes. Now, cubes are a little bit weird because you end up sometimes with the blue cubes, sometimes with the grey cubes. It's going to be a little bit weird requesting these up to a spaceship, and I'm not sure what the best way to get around this is. I did notice that the smashed cubes don't go off, so in theory we could ship large quantities of smashed cubes. We'd get 10,000 at a time, which is 100 cubes, and you can fit 100 cubes onto a rocket. So maybe for a simplicity of logistics, maybe we should be shipping out energized shards instead of energized microcubes, because as I say, the energized shards don't go off. They don't just spoil into the dormant microcubes, so it'd be relatively easy to ship those over. However, as Tristan pointed out, cubes stacked to 10, shards stacked to 100. So whilst transporting the cubes as shards wouldn't take any extra rockets, it would require 10 times as much storage on the spaceship. We would also need a cube smasher, one of these machines, to then reassemble those into cubes at the other end, or possibly even on the spaceship, or just wherever we wanted to have cubes. But it would make the logistics of launching stuff up to the ship a little bit easier. That said, I don't think we care. Because the cubes are just a catalyst and they don't get used up, jet-based mostly, we don't need to ship enormous quantities of them, so we can kind of babysit the rockets and the spaceships a little bit when we're launching these cubes out and taking them off to other planets. So it'd be easy enough just to go, yep, that ship has now got all the cubes it needs, let's send it off, and it can deliver them over at the other end. We've got a second rocket that's not currently in use. This one is going to be eventually taking away yellow cubes when we find something that needs them, and when we have enough that we're ready to start exporting them. Finally, we have a couple of rockets here exporting the concentrated liquid dreams stuff, and that's because Mark has decided that he wants to do things in a slightly odd way. Meanwhile, over on Norvis, we're also bringing out the barrels of concentrated dream extract over here, and bringing it down to an unbarreling machine down here, as we're doing with the magic fluids as well. And you'll notice here we're putting both of those into the same pipe, which is absolutely gross, and I hope we're going in and cleaning those out properly. And in fact we are, because if we follow this pipe round to here, you can see it goes into a tank over here to make sure there's always plenty of buffer. And then we've got these 2 pumps that are going to slurp out any of those fluids that are left in the system, to make sure the relevant fluids always go into the right places. To go to the same station as the magic fluid, to allow a train to come in here and request either one of them, and it will fill up with the appropriate one and take it away. Over here, Tristan's rebuilt the yellow science area to use the Igrian science enhancer machines and have 2 options for the recipe. There's either the one that just uses magic fluid and kicks out yellow science with the 150% productivity bonus that you get from using a science enhancer machine. Alternatively, we can use the Cubium recipe to make the utility science packs, which takes in the same ingredients, the processing units, the flying robot frames, the low density structures, but also takes in an energized microcube and some dream concentrate, and then it also takes in magic fluid because it's running in an Igrian building. And so if you've got all of those things available, then you produce 8 utility science packs every time it runs, instead of only producing 3. So it's almost 3 times as good in exchange for having to deal with all of the Cubium nonsense. This is of course then coupled with the 150% 50% productivity from the Science Enhancer machine, because we are still pumping in the magic fluid, which means we're getting, I don't know, about 700% more science packs out for the same amount of ingredients going in than we would normally. So that's really, really good, but there is an enormous amount of logistics required. You do require cubes, as you've seen before. So we're bringing in the we're bringing in some dull cubes here for some reason by bot. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe this is topping it up from the landing pad just to make sure we've got enough to get the system running. The dull cubes are then being put into a load of chests along here where they can gradually spoil. So eventually we'll see these guys will spoil. This one's got 17 minutes left on it. In here we've got some that are probably a bit lower, like this one with 10 minutes. And once we get up to a certain number of cubes, we should have enough that the system will just keep running. But at the moment we have some shortages. As you can see, there's no blue cubes in the system at the moment, but eventually we'll have some, and then things will start to work a little bit more nicely. And once we have enough, the system should just keep running. The cube supply is being controlled by these two combinators down here, which monitors the number of cubes of any type being passed through from this chest by this inserter, and then counts them up over here. And once that gets up to 3,000 cubes in this system, then it will stop unloading them from this chest. We will still end up with a number of cubes of both types in the chest, but they're available there just in case we ever need to top up, because we decide we want to change the numbers. So this should all work really, really nicely. We've got the cubes available, eventually at least. The problem is the Dream Concentrate. So Mark decided that making anything out of Cubium recipes on Norvis felt like cheating. And he's got a point. Being able to make iron and copper out of nothing, as well as solid fuel and plastic and many, many other things, being able to just have those be magically generated out of nothing is very, very cheaty. And so I think we won't be using any of these sort of cube jelly recipes on any other planet than Cubium, because it's just going to be massively overpowered. We're going to be making stuff from nowhere, and the only place that's allowed to do that is Vulcanus. And even then, from Vulcanus, we're exporting some of the finished goods, but we're not exporting lava pits that we could then be able to make infinite resources out of on other planets. So that's sort of the equivalent for Cubium. However, making the Dream Concentrate, which comes from liquid dream, which comes from dreams, which comes from destabilized cube matter, which comes from jelly, that is an entirely Cubium style chain. So we could pretend there's nothing stopping us making cube jelly on Norvis, and I don't feel it'd be too cheaty to then allow that to decay and decay and decay into the dreams, then liquefy it and then concentrate it, and then feed that into the machines here, and then we'd be able to have plenty of the Dream Concentrate available. And I think in future planets that I'm leading, I'll probably do that. However, Mark has decided it's not acceptable even to produce the Dream Concentrate on Norvis, and so we're not. It's his planet, he can do whatever he likes. And so that means we are shipping that over from Cubium, and that requires quite a lot of rocket launches because it doesn't go very far. As we looked at earlier, it takes 150 Dream Concentrate in order to run the Utility Science Pack recipe once. And that's 3 barrels. And you can only fit about 100 barrels in a rocket. So for each rocket we launch on Cubium, we can only run the recipe on Norvis 33 times. Now, granted, that 33 times will produce 266 science packs, plus the productivity bonuses from using the Igrian machines, which means we'll end up with somewhere in the region of 666 science packs from one rocket, which is a decent number, but it's still not as many as you would fit in an actual rocket. So it's whilst it's good, it's not that good, and it's still going to be a struggle to launch enough Dream Concentrate to keep as many places around the solar system producing science as are going to want to. So I don't know if that's going to be feasible, or whether we should start maybe producing the science packs on Cubium, or maybe we should just start making the jelly on other planets. We'll see how it goes. There is also an additional recipe for making Dream Concentrate, which involves biter eggs, and so is a bit more Norvis friendly and doesn't involve making jelly on this planet. So if we bring over some inverted microcubes, and we have some of these grey cubes knocking around from other purposes, then we get some biter eggs in, which I believe we're going to be able to on this planet at some point in the future, then we would be able to start making Dream Concentrate straight up on this planet. This is a somewhat more complicated recipe to put together than just letting the jelly go off and then dissolving the dreams in water and then concentrating them up a bit, but maybe Mark will feel it's a bit more Norvian appropriate. I think that's probably enough talking about Cubium for one video, so I hope that's been interesting and you haven't drowned too much in the emotions that we've been producing. So thank you very much for watching. I'll be back in the next video to talk a bit more about some of the other improvements we've made on Cubium, because there's been a lot of changes going on over here while we've been trying to get everything sorted out, now that we've worked out and got our heads around how the basic recipes work. We'll be back again on Monday as well for another Planetary Pioneers stream, where, well, maybe by now we'll be off on yet another planet, or maybe we'll be trying to implement all of these crazy improvements on the other planets we've got already. We'll see how that goes. If you'd like to give Planetary Pioneers a shot yourself, then you can grab the mod from the Factorio mod portal, go through and then just play along in with all the same mods we're using. And I hope you enjoy Cubium when you get there. I'll also be back on Wednesday for another stream. I'm playing Foundry at the moment, and I think I'm getting to sort of fairly late game in that. I'm making some absolutely enormous buildings, which will hopefully allow me to make massive quantities of the resources I need. Finally, videos will be coming out every Thursday and Friday on the channel, so please make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on any of those. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.